Strategy, even in normal times, is hard. Strategy, when everything around us seems to be moving and uncertain and unpredictable, can start to feel almost impossible. On today's episode, along with my co-host Mark Gaffin, we are going to talk about how do you start to navigate strategy with a very pragmatic approach for middle market businesses trying to do their very best in the COVID environment. Welcome to Right in the Middle Market, a podcast about pragmatic perspectives on running, growing, and selling your business. We talk about the challenges, decisions, and most importantly, the actions business owners can take to create long-term value in their companies. Over the past few episodes, we've talked a lot about some of the things that we're seeing in the market. We've talked about some of the processes around selling your company and can you sell your company right now. So of the running, growing, and selling part of the topics that we talk about in the podcast, we've been fairly focused on the selling part. Today on our episode, we wanted to come back a little bit to running and growing and really focusing on that which obviously most middle market business owners are really focused on, which is in today's environment, and this was spurred by a great question that came in from one of our listeners, which is to say, look, I love all the information about selling. I'm going to get there someday, but that's not where I am right now. But what do I do right now? And, I feel stuck and it seems like other people I talk to are stuck. And so how do we survive this no man's land where it kind of feels like the extended survival mode?
No, I think we see the same thing. And I think as you and I talk about all the time, it's not, although we break it into to growing and running and selling, really, you need to be running and growing up to the last minute, even if you are selling, right? You want to have that company moving and growing and vibrant with the funnel of opportunities. That's where you're going to get your best valuation. That's where you're going to get your best outcomes in an M&A transaction. So yeah, going back to the people that are running right now, moving to that next level after that kind of crazy survival mode. Maybe we're in through March and April. What is the next step? Are people pausing? Are people waiting? Are people standing by the, outside the ring, just holding on? Or are they jumping into the arena and actually fighting? And I think, we do a lot of research, obviously, not just the anecdotal stuff we see from clients and private equity firms we talk to, but we're also obviously scanning the horizon for information out there. And I came across an article from from my old employer, who had a kind of a part that, in the first half or the second half of this year, the burden of destiny is real, right? The decisions that you make now, this quarter, the second half of this year, are going to have an outsized impact on the trajectory and the robustness of your clients or of your company, right? And so they point out, I think they break it down into two leading questions that people need to ask themselves. And you decide, what are we doing now to protect our company? And then really simultaneously, you have to be talking about what are we doing to, if you will, retool the company for the future. And I love retool because what I think that connotates is there is an underlying platform. There was an economic reason to be in the beginning, but we are going to use different tools probably. We're going to have a different way of doing things in order to move past this dislocation.
Yeah, I think that framework from Bain and Company is a really powerful framework. I think about it also in a healthcare context, right? If you think about it in an acute health crisis versus a chronic disease. And so I think the first part of this year, we were in an acute health crisis, if you will. Actually a real health crisis, but from a business perspective, it was an acute episode. And so, we have heard from a number of businesses. Obviously, there are some that did fine or even expanded, have done really well, but a number that, had to immediately have laser focus on survival of the company, safety of employees, customers, their cash position. And now it seems that we're transitioning from kind of that acute episode to chronic disease. And now we're starting to look at how do we now start to, and I love the word retooling as well, because I think it does start to say chronic disease is something that whether you like it or not, you kind of are going to be living with for some period of time. Hopefully not forever. I really hope this doesn't go on forever. But, this is not something that is going to be over in short order. And so I think now, again, if we bring that analogy back to the business context, it's what changes do we need to make to the way that we're thinking about our revenues, the way we're thinking about our costs, the way that we're thinking about operations. And if you think about in that immediate, acute, traumatic, crisis scenario, there's a whole lot of things that we can do for a short sprint. I would argue we're now coming out of that short sprint and now coming into, we need to start to look at all of those things, the revenues, the cost, the operations, and the strategy, quite frankly, that is sustainable for the coming, certainly the coming months, even if we're not at a point that we can yet start to make a decision about the coming years.
No, I like your analogy there. And I think one of the things that's really kind of special in kind of that special sense of this last episode is if you have a company that runs into a problem, right? You typically aren't having to worry. You're worried about cash. You're worried about costs right away. So you can, on a turnaround assignment, that's kind of what we're trying to get to, visibility of cash inflows and outflows right away, right? When there's tools to deal with that. Unique to this environment, I think, is not only did it happen to everybody over the matter of days, but in this case, you actually had to worry about the safety of your employees, right? I mean, very seldom outside of a natural disaster does that have to be front of mind, but it was, right? People said, what can I do to protect my employees? What can I do to make sure they're safe? And then what can I do to make sure that we can get them functional, right? Then we go back to, okay, how do we preserve? We thought it was 15 days to flatten the curve at the very beginning, right? And I won't go into that, but as a business planner, you're like, what can I do for 15 days? Well, there's an awful lot I can probably do for 15 days. I don't know what day we are into that at this point, but it's beyond 15. And so then you really need to, as you mentioned, and I think that's very astute, is, you look at the cash costs, you look at, stopping, but after a while, you have to then start to think about investing. You have to start thinking about revenues, right? So it's not just about shutting down outflow. You have to start bringing inflow in because you're going to deplete your reserves very quickly. Now, I think the Payroll Protection Act, the PPP loans that people got were helpful there. But again, I think that was designed, even when they designed it, for a short period of time, right? It was to cover, X weeks, 8 weeks of salary, and we're beyond that as well, right? So I think that people are going to have to do that. They have to move past the cost and move into while keeping that. It's an iterative process. We've got to tighten our belts, but we have got to move to the next level of investing. Where can we invest? Where can we move forward? And that goes, I think, to your point about what's our strategy? What are our new goals? If we have to have new goals, even intermediate or long term, and then how do we tweak our strategy to take advantage, and not in a bad way, but there are opportunities that are presented in times like this that were not there in January.
One of the things that's hard is that people are trying to make decisions, and yet there's still so much uncertainty. If you look at, and Mark, you always make this comment about the public markets, that the stock market can deal with good news, it can deal with bad news, it just can't deal with uncertainty. And so if we're talking about private business right now, I think one of the hardest things in making decisions is how do we make decisions when things are so uncertain? And we actually talked about this a lot on our last episode when I had a chance to have a wonderful guest, Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes, who brought the perspective of an operating CEO. And one of the things that she was talking about, we're seeing this in a number of our clients, is saying we have to start to change that decisional horizon, right? Right now, yes, there's always uncertainty in the world, but the magnitude of uncertainty right now is greater than what most of us have seen because there's external. We don't know what governments are going to do. We don't know what's going to continue to happen with the disease. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty. And so, you think of it as almost an agile approach to operations where you start to say, all right, it may be a tough time to make a decision that sets the course definitively for the next 3 years, but can I make a decision, a smaller part of that decision that moves me forward in the next 30 days, keeps options open for, maybe starts to move me in a direction that I think is going to be good for 3 years from now, but at least start to say, what is that small decision? What are those small steps that I can take? And then in an agile method, I know that in another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, I'm going to make another decision. Then I'm going to make the next decision. But how do you use that to shorten that decision time frame to keep moving forward?
I think there's a broader arc to this story, if you will. And I think that as kind of if you will, kind of maybe a bit of a strategy wonk going back to how things were done back in the day, right? If you go back to the 50s and 60s, we had a lot of leaders of organizations that kind of came out of that, that military mindset. And so the strategy was kind of derived from how people would think about a military campaign. And you go back to Alfred Sloan's, General Motors, all those kinds of things. You can see how that was their approach to strategy. It was a much longer period. And I think what's happened over time, both with technology and just the way we approach the world, is things happen much more rapidly, even irrespective of COVID, right? That's happened. I don't know. I was cleaning out a drawer not too long ago and found, what were some of the old handheld Palm Pilots, and then, BlackBerry, and then and I think this literally was a series of boom, 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 boom over 3 years. And so people make decisions a little differently now, and the people that survive, the people that thrive are ones that can use that agile approach. And of course, agile kind of came out of really the software is where it kind of got formalized. How do we approach software? We can't just bang it out and then, remember how they used to shrink wrap it and attach it to the magazine and off it went. Now they're like, we've got to get it out, test it, and it's almost a constant state of development. So there's a bunch of little cycles where you learn, you get it out, and you fix as you go. And I think that there's, people talk about agile manufacturing, people talk about agile marketing, I think that you're right, that there's a component of strategy that can be and should be agile. I think that, you still have to have your goals based on, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, how it needs to be rigorous still, right? It needs to be fact-based. It needs to be a real working hypothesis, but a working hypothesis can be changed as facts present.
Mark, you and I often talk about that strategy is not something that should be esoteric and abstract and results in a beautiful PowerPoint, neatly bound that then sits on the shelf and gathers dust, right?
I like beautiful PowerPoints though, but yes.
Well, okay, that's actually, you like beautiful data graphs, let's be clear. But I think now, oh man, I almost said that hated phrase now more than ever. I hate that phrase. But I do think this is a time when strategy, I believe it always should be pragmatic. That's my natural orientation and my natural bent. But I think right now it has to be tactical, pragmatic. This is not the time. Nobody has the time to take 3 months, 6 months, heck, 6 days off to go and think about the strategy of the company. And if you did, the world would have changed by the time you came back anyway. So how do we start to think about and change that orientation to say, right now, we need to be very pragmatic. We need to be very somewhat tactical. And the piece that I think we can't miss in that we have to make sure we're thinking about is there's an organizational component here. And again, when you think about taking strategy and driving it to execution, you have to, that comes down to people. It's people that do that. And so how do you engage the right people around the table? How do you have the right conversations? And in a time when people are adjusting to, if you will, this new chronic disease, right? This COVID fatigue, people are tired of this. They're starting to try to figure out a new way to do things in their lives, but there's still a lot of grieving and mourning over, the loss of the life that you had and what you thought you would be doing. I talk to people whose kids are going off to college or not going off to college in the way that they expected. Talked with somebody who was diagnosed with cancer, places where, my hometown in Iowa that was destroyed by a horrible, horrible storm. And there are still other things happening in life. So how do we come back and think about, in the midst of even other things that people are dealing with in life that seem that much more painful, how do we start to drive these things forward? And Mark, I want to get your thoughts on that right after we come back from this word from our sponsor. Right in the Middle Market is brought to you by the Gaffin Group, a full-service business consulting firm. The Gaffin Group works closely with middle-market companies tackling the big challenges of today's environment and capturing the value-enhancing growth opportunities of tomorrow. Too often, dogma, platitudes, or wish lists get confused with strategy. Then it's no small wonder that execution can be muddled. The Gaffin Group principals work closely with company boards, executives, and their teams to seek pragmatic, tangible results. They provide comprehensive advisory services across strategic, financial, operational, and merger and acquisition capabilities, all framed by the fundamental belief that real strategy drives real results. The Gaffin Group is focused on delivering robust, practical insights and fact-based pragmatic solutions. Their services are designed to support their clients' profitable growth and sustainable long-term value creation. Go to gaffingroup.com to learn more about how the Gaffin Group can help you and your company. Welcome back. We are here talking about how do you take a strategy with a pragmatic bent to be able to move forward in this particular environment.
I think there's some great points you had there, and I know that we have captured or are capturing in a couple of great episodes. We want to dive in deeply, I think, to the goal setting, strategy, objective tactics kinds of things. I think they're often misdefined in the process, and I think therein lies some of the confusion. And then you wind up having a very, at best lukewarm and sometimes terrible outcome, right? And so I know you did an episode for us on strategic planning, right? And I have been in all kinds of those, and they can be super productive and they can be super engaging and get a lot of people's feedback across different parts of the organization. Like you probably had in March and April, throughout the rules, how do we get this truck loaded with 2 people instead of 6? And you know what? The damn thing was loaded and out the door, and customers got taken care of. We blew down, standard operating procedure, the dreaded, this is the way we've always done it, and got it done. So you have those kind of conversations and should have them now. But what we're talking about, do the goals that we as an organization have in our, that are aligned with our mission statement, they're aligned with our vision, the goals that we would like to achieve in our sector, in adjacent sectors, did those really change between January and today? Maybe there might be a part of your sector, your or your industry that has fundamentally changed because of supply chain or renationalization of manufacturing, things like that. But I would bet that for many companies, if you said, okay, our goals may not have changed much, or there's still a very good working hypothesis of where we want to be, the strategy of how we get from today to there may very well have changed. And that's to the part I think you talk about pragmatic, right? It has to be, if it's not pragmatic, what do we do on Monday? Again, when I was with Bain, that was a big deal. What do I do on Monday morning? This is great information. What do I do on Monday morning to actually start moving on that journey? So we set up those objectives, which are sometimes milestones along the way. Those, again, may have changed, right? In order, like, for example, I'll use mergers and acquisitions, which a lot of people don't think about because it's not their top talent, but this is a good time to think about, gosh, are there capabilities that I could buy, invest in now that would actually move me forward on that journey?
I like your point about we're really looking critically at where goals have changed or haven't changed, and to be able to really break down and think about it in a very logical way about what specifically has changed. I think it can be tempting to throw our hands up in the air a little bit and feel like everything has changed, but to really be able to break it down and say what has changed and what is the same. For many organizations, I think your core mission, right, the way you want to interact with the world, probably, for most organizations, I'm not saying there aren't some, but for most organizations, that's probably the same. You may need to go about it in a very different way. But I think part of this too, again, I'm going to come back to my concept of kind of the short actions we take in the adrenaline fueled crisis versus what we do over the longer term. and pull in a piece of data I saw recently about what's happening to communication and relationships among executive teams in the COVID environment where we can't be together. And the thing that was really interesting is they said for those that came in to this period, to this crisis with strong relationships, those have actually stayed the same or have gotten stronger. But those relationships that were weak to begin with have actually gotten weaker. And so I've talked to a number of people who have said, you know what, I'm doing more check-ins with my team. I actually am building those relationships, and that's great. But really be thoughtful about where those relationships may not be as strong. And now layer on top of that, Mark, to your point, in all likelihood, there are goals that have probably changed. And certainly the strategies, the objectives probably have changed, and we're going to need to go about it a different way. We're focusing on some different interim milestones, and which means that we've got to have everybody coming together around a new plan. So would really encourage business owners to look around and they're very thoughtful about don't just look at the relationships that are strong, but who on your team maybe is falling behind, who isn't voicing that objection, who isn't in the right place to be able to continue to drive forward, because that's much harder to do. If you were all sitting in a room together, you could kind of pick it up, right? You know your team, you can tell who's deliberately avoiding eye contact and, isn't really engaged in the meeting. That's a lot harder to do on Zoom.
Well, yeah, to your point, I want to dive down to why is that person maybe not engaged? Are they not engaged because I didn't explain it well, or they're not bought in? That's an issue I got to deal with. If there could be issues that they have, can't engage in the new model. I want to read just one real piece, one real quick quote out of the Bain paper, and they said, as new cases of COVID-19 start to drop off and economic life appears to stabilize, firms need to be ready with strong working hypotheses about the dynamics of their industry and the right strategy to outperform. The companies that adapt faster to the initial upswing and eventually the new environment emerge stronger. And I think what that means when we're talking about these goals maybe changing, you know what? They may actually well change in your favor. If competitors and your people in your industry are stuck or are in stasis, if you will, for the next 6 to 8 months, that's an opportunity to strike, and it's not a bad thing. Customers need to be served, markets need to be satisfied. And so people that can get your team, engaged, get out there and figure out what's going on in our industry. What's my balance sheet look like? Can I gain capital? And that's where advisors, I think, can be helpful sometimes to bring that external, component and data rigor to that discussion and push the thinking still. I don't think it would be tragic to fall back to old ways if new ways are actually going to be better, right? Just because they're more comfortable.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And maybe one of the benefits of the fact that this has gone on so long is we look around, many of the things that we do, we can't do in the old way. And this was such a dramatic change that we really did have to, for many, it wasn't as simple as, okay, we just all work from home. Yes, for some industries, dependent, professional services, you could largely just say, okay, my in-person meeting is now a Zoom call. But for most companies, for most industries, the changes are far more dramatic than that. And particularly now that we're looking at this going on for a longer period of time. And, the old adage of never waste a good crisis, right? But I do think that it is the burning platform, but if you think about it from a change management lens, we had to break the old ways. And I think now there's a perfect opportunity to be able to say, look, this is not just about figuring out how to recreate exactly what we did before in a virtual or socially distant manner. It is about, if I fundamentally break that down, and Mark, to your point, I think this is where sometimes an external advisor, or at least bringing in maybe somebody from a different part of the company, but someone who can help you take a fresh look at this and say, how do I bring this back down to what are the core aspects that I have to accomplish? What am I really trying to do with this process? And how do I do it not just in a crisis we can all get through this by staying up all night and, doing whatever has to get done, but now creating something that is sustainable for certainly the coming months. And ideally you come out of this having figured out actually a better way to operate your business.
So, I'll take a slightly, not a different view, but I want to go back to, if you see in times where they're relatively benign, and look, we've had a relatively long period of benign economic activity pre-March, right? And even then, as we talk about, and we see this in our consulting practice all the time, there are companies that recognize that maybe they have dropped a gear, right? And the market's moving past them or moving aside from them. And there's a lot of symptoms. You're going to see that market, margin compression, retention of clients, share of wallet, those kinds of things. And so even in given times, it's almost like that fault line in the San Andreas fault, it builds pressure, and then there's a dislocation, right? So that company all of a sudden will feel it. And there's, and that's when they're by themselves and they're not keeping up with the industry. I think one of our clients, I loved his, he called it the tyranny of mediocre performance, right? So you're making money, you have a margin, it's declining, but it's not zero. It's strained, but we can still pay and do the things we want to. And what we've seen in the past, you have a recession, 6 to 7 years, right? So kind of everybody's thrown in there. Everybody's got to go weed through operating expenses and clean up the budget and re-engage, and you hire the right people and maybe some other people move on. And that's just a normal part of life writ large, right? This kind of thing happened to everybody all at once. And I think the companies that are really that power out of this are the ones that are early to recognize that can deal with a low signal to noise ratio, right? There's a lot of uncertainty out there. There's a low signal, but if there is a signal, and what can I use that signal for? How do I move forward? I think Annie Duke's book, Placing Bets, kind of how do you, and it's not bets in a bad way, but it's not betting the farm in any one direction, but how do I can I really look at adjacent markets where our core skills could work and go that way?
Well, and I think also if we come back to a concept I know we've talked about before, which is preserving optionality, right? So if you think about, if you're sitting right now and trying to make some key decisions about your business, look at them, I guess this would be, one way to would encourage folks to look at it and say, what decision of the choices in front of me keeps the most options in front of me? How do I not commit to a certain path earlier or for longer than what I need to? Really tactical example, you and I looked at a new platform that we wanted to use recently. And quite frankly, I chose the monthly billing option as opposed to the annual because, and this is something, it's $10 a month or whatever, but I just looked at it and said, right now, I want to keep my options open. But so if you look at it and say, where can I, in a smart way, keep my options open, keep that flexibility? I need to be able to be nimble. I need to be able to respond to the environment as it continues to change and evolve. And so if you're always looking at it to say, but part of, I think, is also realizing that not doing anything, right? It can be tempting to say, to preserve the most options, that I just shouldn't do anything, right? I should just sit here and not make any decisions and not do anything. But remember that not acting is a decision in and of itself. And if you're not taking actions, if you're not seeking new revenue, there are options that are going to disappear. And so it's figuring out, what is that right balance of the smart actions I can take today with the right time horizon that maximize my options and flexibility for the months ahead? We always like to wrap up. Again, our mantra is all about being pragmatic and pragmatic advice. So we're going to wrap up with 2 pragmatic things, 2 pragmatic tips, things that you can do right now. Mark, do you want to go first?
Yeah, let me go first. I think I would go back to the original questions we started the session with. And that was, protect and recover, retool. I think the protect phase is not something that's done, right? You'd love to be done, but it's not. And even in normal times, we're always protecting our assets. We're always protecting cash flow. But I would challenge our folks that this is still a good time to find some discipline in cash flow. This is not a time to be leaking cash on things that just are not deriving value for the company. This isn't the time to do that. This is a time to be finding cash and reinvesting it in growth. And that kind of goes into the second thing I would do is to say it is about investing now, right? It is about capturing opportunities. It's about how we talked about advisors. Those don't have to be outside consultants necessarily. It could be your advisory board. It could be your board. It could be a mentor you have, but also getting diverse opinions, getting people that will really challenge you as a CEO or as a leader of a middle market company is a positive, right? If I was a CFO of a middle market company and a portfolio company of a private equity firm, it's good to have people questioning. You have to defend your position. It keeps you sharp. And that's what we need right now. We don't need to, the crisis, as you kind of pointed out, the acute part's going to wear off. The adrenaline goes. What we cannot do is be flat. We can't do nothing for the next 6 months. So I would challenge, the companies out there to think about where do we want to go? If that's not changed or it's still attainable, then figuring out how to get there is something we can, that we can work on. There is a strategy to get from here to there. There are objectives that we can lay out to get there. And that I think is still a very viable path.
Okay. So my two, I'm going to try to be, as succinct on these as I can. But I think the first one, I'm going to come back to decision points. So look at a decision that's in front of you today, a big decision, something that has really been weighing on you, something that you've been struggling with, and get really tactical and bring to it that lens of agile, preserving options. Look at it and with that lens of what decision can I make, or is there a way I can break this decision apart that allows me to keep as many options open as I can, which includes taking action. That doesn't mean don't make a decision, but it includes taking action. So that would be my first one, is to look at a key decision that you've been struggling with in that new light. And the second one, I think, Mark, is maybe similar to where you ended, which is ask for help. Right? This is not a time to try to soldier on. We always say that being a CEO is the loneliest job in the world. And right now, man, it's really lonely. And so ask for help. I'm sure that you have advisors around you, people who've been with you for a long time. Mark, as you were saying, it's mentors, it's board members, it's peers, but reach out to those people. This is a time when being able to have someone who can listen, who can help ask questions, who can help probe, help push. It may be the time to bring on a new advisor if you don't have someone like that around you, but it may be an advisor that you already have. And so really be thoughtful about that, but don't be afraid to ask for help. So with that, I'm Stephanie Chambliss-Gaffin, and you've been listening to Right in the Middle Market, a podcast about running, growing, and selling your middle market business. We hope that today has been helpful in thinking about how can you start to look at this new world and what does strategy and operations look like in this new world. We'd love to hear your comments about today's episode or ideas for topics you'd like to hear about in the future. Send me a message on LinkedIn or drop me a line at podcast@gaffingroup.com. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more pragmatic tips on upcoming episodes. Until next time, be well and be pragmatic.